He didn't know I was about to be introduced as the new CEO of the billion-dollar company he'd spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder to lead. Sometimes the sweetest success is the one they never see coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany doors of Global Innovation's main boardroom felt heavy under my hands as I purposefully arrived 10 minutes late to the annual leadership meeting. My fingertips traced the elegant gold lettering on the door. Executive Conference. Room A. Savoring the moment before everything would change. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see the silhouettes of 23 people who thought they knew exactly who I was. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. My husband David, the company's COO, barely glanced up as I quietly took a seat in the back row, his attention focused on the presentation he was delivering to the board. I caught the slight eye roll he shared with Marcus Chen, his VP of Operations, when they noticed my deliberately inappropriate business casual attire. A simple navy blazer from a department store chain, paired with a modest skirt. Not exactly the power suit expected at a board meeting of a Fortune 500 company, the room itself breathed old money and power. Hand-carved panels lined the walls, a testament to the company's century-old legacy. The massive abstract painting behind David's head had cost more than most people's homes. I knew because I'd quietly authorized its purchase last month, my first unofficial act as majority shareholder. As I was saying, David continued, straightening his custom Italian tie with that characteristic gesture I'd grown to find so ironic. Our leadership transition needs to be handled with utmost precision. After CEO Richardson's unexpected retirement, we need someone with real executive experience, someone who understands the cutthroat nature of global technology markets. He paused, shooting me another dismissive glance. Not someone who just reads about it in business magazines or plays entrepreneur with a small consulting operation. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, several checking their watches. They knew what was coming next. I adjusted my deliberately modest blazer, hiding a smile as I remembered the stack of signed agreements in my briefcase, the results of 6 months of playing entrepreneur while orchestrating the largest silent acquisition in the company's history. The same documents that had made Richardson's unexpected retirement considerably more lucrative than anyone in this room suspected. In fact, David continued, his voice dripping with the same condescension I'd endured at countless dinner parties, my wife's little consulting business is the perfect example of why we need seasoned leadership. Honey, didn't you tell me last week you finally landed your first real client? A few of his loyal lieutenants chuckled. The same inner circle that gathered at our home every Friday for drinks, unknowingly discussing confidential company strategies in front of the very person they were trying to impress with their insider knowledge. If they'd ever bothered to ask about my struggling consulting business, they might have discovered that Maxwell International Group had quietly become one of the most successful private equity firms in Asia over the past decade. The room fell, silent as Board Chairman Wilson cleared his throat, checking his watch one final time. It was 9:30 a.m. exactly, the moment we had all planned for, except David. I could see Sarah, my chief of strategic operations, slip quietly into the room through the side door, taking her position by the main screen. David had always assumed she was just another board member's executive assistant. He'd never bothered to look closely at the organizational charts of our overseas operations. Actually, David, I said, standing and walking to the front of the room, my Louboutins now clearly visible beneath my modest attire. I landed my biggest client 6 months ago. I placed my briefcase on the table, retrieving the acquisition. Documents. When I purchased controlling interest in Global Innovations through my little consulting business, Maxwell International Group, the color drained from David's face as Chairman Wilson stood, a slight smile playing at his lips. I watched the realization hit David in waves. First confusion, then disbelief, And finally, the dawning horror of understanding. His perfect world of corner offices and executive perks was about to be turned upside down. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wilson announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority David had always craved. "Allow me to formally introduce our new Chief Executive Officer, Catherine Maxwell." Catherine Maxwell. The silence in the room was absolute. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city sprawling below us, my reflection overlaid on the glass, no longer the supportive wife playing at business, but the woman who had just orchestrated one of the most sophisticated corporate acquisitions of the decade. Sometimes the most powerful move in chess isn't capturing your opponent's queen, it's letting them underestimate your pawn until the perfect moment. And as I took my place at the head of the table, I couldn't help but appreciate the poetry of the moment. David had spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder, never realizing his own wife had quietly bought the building. The story of how I became Catherine Maxwell, hidden owner of a global business empire, began 15 years ago in a very different boardroom. Back then, I was Marcus Chen, sitting beside my father as he fought to keep control of the small tech company he'd built from nothing. I watched helplessly as men in expensive suits, armed with hostile takeover agreements, stripped away 20 years of his work in a single afternoon. "Remember this moment, Katie," my father had said afterward, his voice steady despite everything. "In business, people see what they expect to see. The trick isn't proving them wrong, it's making their assumptions work for you." Those words shaped my next decade. While my father rebuilt his life with a small consulting practice, I was crafting a different kind of revenge. Not the loud, dramatic kind that made headlines, but something quieter, more methodical. I completed my MBA at night while working, entry-level jobs during the day, deliberately staying in positions where I'd be underestimated. Every dismissive comment, every patronizing pat on the head, every "honey, leave the business talk to the men," became fuel for my determination. My first real breakthrough came when I landed a junior position at Maxwell International, a struggling investment firm in Singapore. The owner, Jonathan Maxwell, was in his 70s and had no heirs interested in the business. While my colleagues focused on impressing the senior management with PowerPoint presentations and golf course dealings, I spent my evenings analyzing the firm's untapped potential in emerging markets. "Young lady," Jonathan had said when I finally presented my findings, "you're either brilliant or insane." 6 months later, he made me his protégé. 2 years after that, on his deathbed, he left me controlling interest in the company, much to the shock of his nephews who'd never bothered to learn the business. "Build something that lasts," he told me in our final conversation. "But remember, the strongest foundations are often invisible." I took those words to heart. Over the next 5 years, I transformed Maxwell International into a powerhouse, operating through a complex network of shell companies and investment vehicles. We specialized in silent acquisitions, buying controlling interests in companies so quietly that often even their boards didn't realize who really owned them until months later. That's when I met David Morrison. He was everything I thought I wanted: ambitious, successful, and completely focused on climbing the corporate ladder at Global Innovations. Our courtship was a whirlwind of charity galas and business functions. I played my part perfectly: the admiring girlfriend, then fiancé, who ran a small consulting business while supporting his career. "You don't need to work, honey," he'd said after we married, his tone a mixture of affection and condescension. My new position as COO comes with more than enough to support us both. What he didn't know was that I'd been watching Global Innovations for years. The company had striking similarities to my father's old firm: innovative technology, dedicated employees, but leadership more focused on their own bonuses than long-term growth. When David started bringing his executive team home for dinner, parties, I listened carefully to their drunken boasts about restructuring plans and potential acquisitions. "My wife's surprisingly good at organizing these little gatherings," David would tell them. never noticing how their casual conversations about company strategy were being carefully cataloged and analyzed. Every Friday night, as they relaxed, in our living room, Sarah, my actual chief of strategic operations, would serve them drinks in her role as our part-time housekeeper, gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable. The real work happened in my private office, hidden behind a false wall in our home library. While David thought I was working on my little business plans, I was orchestrating a complex web of stock purchases and proxy agreements. Through various shell companies and investment vehicles, Maxwell International Group was slowly, invisibly, acquiring significant portions of Global Innovation's stock. The turning point came 6 months ago when CEO Richardson announced his retirement plans to the board. David immediately began positioning himself as the natural successor, never realizing that his own wife was already the company's largest shareholder through a dozen different entities. "You should come to the transition announcement," David had said last week, his tone patronizing. "It'll be good for you to see how real corporate leadership works. Maybe you'll pick up some tips for your consulting business." I smiled, thinking of the signed agreements already in my safe. Richardson had been surprisingly amenable to an early retirement, once he understood who really controlled the company now. The board had quickly aligned behind my vision for Global Innovation's future, recognizing the strategic brilliance of the silent acquisition. "The best power," my father had once told me, "is the power they don't see coming." As I built my empire, from the shadows, I discovered he was right. True strength didn't always look like corner offices and executive titles. Sometimes it looked like a struggling consultant, serving drinks to overconfident executives while quietly buying the company from under them. The irony of using David's own assumptions against him wasn't lost on me. Every time he belittled my career or mansplained basic business concepts at dinner parties, he was actually revealing valuable insights into Global Innovation's vulnerabilities. His certainty that I could never understand real business had made him careless with confidential information, never suspecting that his little wife was actually one of the most successful private equity investors in Asia. Standing in my hidden office the night before the board meeting, I looked at the photo of my father on my desk. He had passed away 2 years ago, never knowing that I'd built something far bigger than his original company. But I'd followed his most important lesson. I'd made people's assumptions work for me. Tomorrow, those assumptions would finally shatter. Maintaining the illusion of Catherine Morrison, the struggling business consultant, required a level of detail that would have impressed the most meticulous theater director. Every element of my public persona was carefully crafted, from the mid-range car I drove to client meetings, to the deliberately modest office I rented in a Class B building downtown. Even my wardrobe was a calculated performance, expensive, enough to suggest aspiration, but not success. The real nerve center of my operation lay hidden behind a biometric-secured door in my home office. While David thought I was working on small business proposals in the front room, the actual command center hummed with activity behind a concealed panel. 3 monitors displayed real-time data from global markets, secure communications with my international teams, and surveillance feeds from key locations within Global Innovations. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah would say whenever she called, maintaining our cover even on secure lines, "I have those catering estimates for your next dinner party." It became our code for strategic updates about our ongoing acquisition of Global Innovations shares. The menu planning sessions were actually strategy meetings where we coordinated our next moves. The dinner parties themselves were masterpieces of misdirection. Every Friday night, David would bring home his executive team, never realizing these social gatherings were actually intelligence-gathering operations. I played the role of gracious hostess perfectly, serving drinks and appearing to only half listen to their shop talk while actually recording every detail. "Katie, honey," David would say, using the diminutive form of my name he knew I disliked. "Why don't you let the men discuss business?" He'd pat my hand dismissively, never noticing how Sarah, posing as our server, would position herself to better hear their conversations about upcoming strategic decisions. My real world existed in carefully controlled spaces. The Singapore office of Maxwell International Group operated from an unmarked floor in a prestigious business tower. My visits there were disguised as girls' trips with college friends, trips that David encouraged, happy to have me out of the way during important business periods. He never questioned why these trips often coincided with major corporate decisions at global innovations. Women need their little getaways, he'd say condescendingly, while I was actually conducting high-level meetings with international investors and coordinating complex financial maneuvers. The technology supporting my deception was state-of-the-art. My private smartphone, hidden in a compartment in my desk, operated on an encrypted network that even government agencies would struggle to crack. Every email, every document, every transaction was protected by multiple layers of security. Meanwhile, I maintained a regular phone full of mundane messages and basic business apps that David occasionally checked for my own good. One close call came when David unexpectedly brought home the company's head of IT security for dinner. I'd had only minutes to activate the electromagnetic shielding in my hidden office, blocking any possibility of him detecting the high-powered computing equipment concealed there. As they discussed cybersecurity over steaks, I played the role of the confused spouse asking basic questions about firewalls, all while running a complex acquisition algorithm on servers halfway around the world. Maybe I should look at securing your business laptop, Katie, the IT head had offered kindly. Wouldn't want your client records getting hacked. I'd laughed and thanked him, knowing that my actual security systems were years ahead of anything Global Innovations was using. In fact, several of their breakthrough security protocols had been quietly based on technologies my team had already developed and discarded as obsolete. The psychological aspect of the deception was perhaps the most challenging. I had to maintain not just a false identity, but a completely different personality. Catherine Morrison was agreeable, somewhat naive about business matters, and always eager for her husband's approval. She dressed conventionally, spoke softly, and never challenged the status quo. Meanwhile, Catherine Maxwell, the hidden CEO of a global business empire, was making decisions that would reshape entire industries. You should hear my wife trying to explain market dynamics, David would laugh with his colleagues. It's adorable how she thinks her little consulting business is preparing her for the real corporate world. Those moments required the most control, sitting quietly while they mocked my understanding of business concepts I had mastered years ago. But every patronizing comment, every dismissive laugh, only served to make my cover more convincing. After all, who would suspect that the woman they so readily underestimated was orchestrating one of the most sophisticated corporate takeovers in recent history? The physical evidence of my double life was secured in a series of hidden safes and secure servers. The main safe, concealed behind an awards wall celebrating David's corporate achievements, oh, the irony, contained the most sensitive documents: ownership certificates, merger agreements, and the original contracts from my inheritance of Maxwell International Group. A second safe, hidden under the floorboards of my closet, held emergency passports, alternative identification, and enough cash to disappear completely if needed. My daily routine was a carefully choreographed dance of appearances and reality. Mornings were spent in my modest consulting office, meeting with small business clients who served as the perfect cover for my supposed career. Afternoons often involved yoga classes or charity committee meetings that were actually secure, video conferences with my global management team. Every movement, every appointment, every piece of communication was structured to maintain the illusion while advancing my true objectives. The most elaborate deception involved my supposed business struggles. I maintained a separate accounting system for my consulting business, deliberately showing modest income and occasional setbacks that David could track through our shared banking app. Meanwhile, the real financial empire I controlled operated through a complex network of offshore accounts and shell corporations that would have taken teams of forensic accountants years to unravel. Maybe it's time to consider focusing on our family instead of your business, David had suggested last month, his tone dripping with fake concern. Your last quarterly revenue barely covered your office rent. Little did he know that while he was worrying about my small consulting fees, I had just closed a deal worth more than Global Innovation's entire annual revenue. The family planning appointment I had scheduled for the following week was actually a meeting with Global Innovation's largest institutional investor, finalizing their support for my upcoming revelation as CEO. The weeks leading up to the board meeting were filled with moments that tested my composure to its limits. Each incident added another layer of justification for what was to come, like watching a master chef prepare a complicated dish, every ingredient carefully measured, every timing precise. The breaking point nearly came during Global Innovation's annual charity gala 3 weeks ago. I stood in our walk-in closet, deliberately choosing a simple black dress, while David adjusted his custom tuxedo in the mirror. He was practically glowing with self-importance, having just learned he was on the shortlist to replace retiring CEO Richardson. "Remember to stick close to Jennifer Chen tonight," he instructed, straightening his bow tie. "She's the VP of Marketing, and it would look good if my wife formed a connection with some of the senior female executives." His tone shifted to that patronizing lilt I'd grown to despise. "Just try not to give her any business advice like last time. I had to smooth things over after you tried explaining digital marketing to her." The irony was exquisite. Jennifer Chen had actually implemented my suggested marketing strategy, but through a series of proxies and consultants I'd arranged. Global Innovation's digital presence had tripled since then, though David still credited it to the team's natural evolution. The gala itself was a masterclass in barely contained rage. I watched David work the room, dropping hints about his imminent promotion while deliberately steering me away from any substantial conversations with board members. What he didn't know was that I'd already had private meetings with each of them, under my other identity, through carefully orchestrated chance encounters at various international business events. "Oh, Katie," he called out across the ballroom, using that sing-song voice reserved for wives he thought needed managing. "Come meet Richard from Business Development. He's fascinating. Been with the company 20 years. I smiled politely as I joined them, knowing that Richard's position would be one of the first to be restructured after my takeover. His department's inefficiencies had cost the company millions, all carefully documented in reports he'd dismissed because they came from lower-level employees. "Your husband tells me you do some small business consulting," Richard said, barely, concealing his disinterest. "Must be quite a change from running a household. How do you handle the complexity?" Before I could respond, David jumped in. "Oh, she mostly helps local shops with their bookkeeping. Nothing too complicated, right?" "Honey?" He squeezed my shoulder in what observers might have thought was affection, but I recognized as a warning to stay quiet. Later that evening, I excused myself to powder my nose and slipped into the empty conference room adjacent to the ballroom. Sarah was waiting with updates from our Singapore office. The latest stock acquisition had gone through. We now controlled 48% of Global Innovation's shares through various shell companies. "David's team is getting suspicious about the trading patterns," Sarah reported, showing me the internal memo she'd intercepted. "They're launching an investigation into the unusual market activity." I smiled, knowing the investigation would lead nowhere. Our purchases had been carefully structured through dozens of seemingly unrelated entities. Let them investigate. It'll keep them distracted from what's really happening. Returning to the gala, I arrived just in time to hear David holding court, with his executive team, champagne flowing freely as they discussed the company's future. "The problem with Global Innovations," he was saying, "is that it's been too soft. Too many decisions made by committee. Too much concern about employee satisfaction. What we need is strong, decisive leadership." He caught my eye and smirked. Take my wife's approach to business, for example. All that time spent worrying about client relationships and employee well-being. That's why she can barely cover her office rent. His colleagues laughed, as they always did at his jokes. Marcus Chen, his VP of operations, chimed in. At least she's not asking you to invest in her business anymore. Remember when she wanted to pitch you on some tech startup idea? That tech startup idea had been a subtle test. I'd deliberately leaked information about a revolutionary AI technology through my consulting business, watching to see how global innovation's leadership would respond. Their dismissal of it had confirmed my suspicions about their innovation blindness. 2 months later, Maxwell International Group had acquired the technology through a subsidiary, now valued at triple its initial worth. The next morning, over breakfast, David was still riding high from his gala performance. I've been thinking, he said, buttering his toast with authority. Maybe it's time to close down your consulting business. When I become CEO, it might look, well, unprofessional to have my wife struggling with a small business on the side. I took a sip of coffee to hide my expression, remembering the signed CEO contract already in my safe. You really think you'll get the position? It's practically guaranteed, he boasted. The board knows we need someone with real business acumen, not just another paper pusher. He reached across the table to pat my hand. Don't worry, honey. Once I'm CEO, you won't have to pretend to be a businesswoman anymore. That evening, in my hidden office, I reviewed the final preparations for the UAS takeover. David's performance at the gala had provided the perfect justification for our accelerated timeline. Sarah's team had documented every dismissive comment, every instance of him leveraging company relationships for personal gain. The board review committee meets tomorrow, Sarah reported via secure video link. They'll be formalizing the CEO selection process. I nodded, pulling up the dossier we'd compiled on David's executive team. Make sure our evidence of their market manipulation is ready. I want individual files on each of them. The next week brought more moments of delicious tension. David hosted a strategy dinner at our home, inviting his closest allies within the company. I played my usual role of the quiet hostess, serving drinks while they discussed their plans for global innovation's future. We'll need to streamline operations, Marcus was saying, accepting a whiskey from my hand without even a glance of acknowledgement. Cut out the dead weight, starting with these diversity hire programs. Speaking of dead weight, another executive joked, nodding in my direction as I left the room. When are you going to convince your wife to give up her little business adventure? Their laughter followed me into the kitchen, where Sarah was organizing dessert plates while simultaneously transmitting their conversations to our legal team. Every word they spoke was another nail in their professional coffins, though they were too arrogant to realize it. The final straw came during their discussion of the mysterious stock purchases. Someone's buying up shares through multiple channels, David explained, the alcohol making him careless with confidential information. But don't worry, I've got IT tracking down these ghost investors. Nobody makes a move in my company without me knowing about it. I retreated to my hidden office, listening through the secure feed as they continued boasting about their plans for the company. My company. In less than a week, their arrogance would be their undoing. Every dismissive comment, every moment of condescension had only served to make my eventual triumph more complete. While David and his executive team were congratulating themselves on their corporate maneuvering, my real power was operating in the shadows, extending far beyond the eye. Walls of global innovations. The true scope of my influence would have shattered their perception of little Katie, if they'd been clever enough to see it. My hidden office transformed at night into the command center of a vast business empire. After David fell asleep, convinced his wife was resting after another unsuccessful day of consulting, I would activate the secure systems concealed behind the bookshelf. The wall panels would slide silently apart, revealing an array of monitors that connected me to operations across 3 continents. Maxwell International Group quarterly numbers are in, Sarah reported during one of our midnight sessions, her image crystal clear on the secure video link. Our Asian subsidiaries have exceeded projections by 37%. The Singapore office suggests accelerating our timeline for the global innovations integration. I studied the complex web of financial data flowing across my screens. Through carefully structured shell companies and investment vehicles, we now controlled not just global innovations shares, but significant portions of their supply chain. Every major vendor, every key contractor, all had been quietly acquired or influenced through my network. What about Project Oracle? I asked, referring to our AI-driven market analysis system. It had been analyzing global innovations' internal communications and financial patterns for months, predicting the optimal moment for my revelation. Sarah pulled up a series of complex algorithms. The system suggests next week's board meeting will provide maximum impact. David's team has already leaked their succession plans to key stakeholders. Their overconfidence makes them particularly vulnerable. The irony was delicious. While David boasted about his business acumen over dinner, my technology was already dismantling his power base piece by piece. Every casual conversation he had with board members was analyzed and countered through subtle influences they never detected. My network of influence extended into unexpected places. The cleaning staff at Global Innovations headquarters included several highly trained analysts from my Singapore team. The company's favorite catering service was actually a Maxwell International subsidiary, giving us eyes and ears at every major corporate event. Even the luxury car service that transported board members was owned by one of my shell companies, its drivers carefully trained to gather intelligence during seemingly innocent conversations. The preliminary board vote is scheduled for tomorrow morning, Sarah continued, pulling up another screen of data. Our sources confirm David has been lobbying hard, promising significant changes to corporate structure. I smiled, remembering his arrogant commentary at dinner about streamlining operations and cutting dead weight. What he didn't know was that my team had already developed a comprehensive restructuring plan, one that would actually improve efficiency while protecting employee interests. Show me the latest from Operation Mirror, I instructed, referring to our shadow executive team. For every position in David's leadership structure, I had already selected and prepared replacements. Talented individuals who had been overlooked or pushed aside by the old boys network were being quietly mentored and positioned for promotion. The organizational chart materialized on my main screen, a complex network of relationships and capabilities that would transform global innovations. Jennifer Chen from marketing, who David had so often dismissed, was actually one of my most valuable allies. Her basic digital strategy had been carefully crafted in consultation with my international marketing experts. The transition teams are ready, Sarah confirmed, highlighting various positions on the chart. We can implement the new structure within hours of the announcement. HR has already prepared the necessary documentation, hidden within their standard files. My phone buzzed with a priority alert from our surveillance system. David was stirring upstairs, probably heading to the kitchen for his usual midnight snack. With practiced efficiency, I activated the office's camouflage mode. The monitors silently recessed into the walls, replaced by innocent-looking bookshelves. By the time David passed by the office door, he saw only a dim desk lamp and scattered consulting papers. "Still working, honey?" he asked, pausing in the doorway. "Don't stay up too late. You know how you get when you're overtired. Remember that presentation you messed up last month?" That messed-up presentation had actually been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to reinforce his perception of my business incompetence. Meanwhile, across the world, my real presentation to the Asian Finance Summit had just concluded, delivered through a trusted proxy while I maintained my cover at home. "You're right," I said, shuffling papers with deliberate awkwardness. "I just need to finish these client invoices." The invoices were actually encrypted status reports from our global operations team, but he never looked closely enough to notice. After he returned to bed, I reactivated the command center. "Show me the latest surveillance from his executive team meetings," I instructed the system. The screens came alive with footage from various sources: security cameras, phone recordings, email interceptors. Every boast, every dismissive comment, every unethical decision was being cataloged and analyzed. "Their overconfidence is their weakness," Sarah observed, watching David's VP of Operations mock a female colleague's strategic proposal. A proposal that had originally come from our think tank in Singapore. "No," I corrected her, thinking of the years of patronizing treatment I'd endured. "Their weakness is assuming they know who holds the real power. Show me the final numbers on our share acquisition." The display shifted to a complex ownership diagram. Through various entities and proxy votes, we now controlled nearly 60% of Global Innovation's voting shares. David's team was so focused on their internal power plays that they'd failed to notice their company being quietly purchased out from under them. The board chairman's office confirmed the final schedule for next week's meeting, Sarah reported. They've allocated 30 minutes for David's CEO candidacy presentation. I smiled, thinking of the carefully prepared documents waiting in my safe. He won't need that long. Make sure all our people are in position by 9. I want everything ready before I make my entrance. The screens showed our preparations spanning the globe, legal teams standing by in 3 countries, transition managers ready to implement our restructuring plan, communication strategies prepared for every possible scenario. While David dreamed of his imagined triumph upstairs, the real power in Global Innovations was quietly humming in my hidden command center, preparing to reshape the company's future. The evening before the board meeting marked the point of no return. David had invited his entire executive team to our home for what he called a strategy dinner, but was really an early celebration of his presumed CEO appointment. I watched them arrive one by one, each carrying expensive bottles of wine and wearing identically smug expressions. The gathering took place in our formal dining room, where I'd hosted countless such evenings while gathering intelligence. Tonight was different. Tonight would be the last time I would play the role of the deferential wife. The hidden cameras I'd installed years ago were recording everything, adding final pieces of evidence to our already substantial collection. "Gentlemen," David announced, standing at the head of the table. My table, bought with my money through one of my shell companies. "Tomorrow marks the beginning of a new era for Global Innovations." He raised his glass, the crystal catching the light. "By this time tomorrow, we'll have officially begun our transformation into the company we've always known it could be." Marcus Chen, the VP of Operations, chuckled. "Assuming Katie doesn't decide to apply for the CEO position herself." The room erupted in laughter, the kind that carried an edge of cruelty. I busied myself serving their food, each plate costing more than what they thought I made in a month. "Speaking of which," David said, his voice taking on that public speaking tone he practiced in the mirror. "Honey, why don't you tell everyone about your meeting with that potential client today? The one who wanted social media advice?" I could feel Sarah, playing her role as our server, tense slightly behind me. She knew as well as I did that my actual meeting today had been with Global Innovation's largest institutional investor, securing their support for tomorrow's revelation. "Oh, it was nothing special," I said, maintaining my practiced mask of mild embarrassment. "Just a small local business looking for help with their online presence." "See, this is what I mean about natural hierarchies in business," David continued, warming to his favorite theme. "Some people are meant to lead Fortune 500 companies, and others," he gestured toward me with his wine glass, "are meant to help mom-and-pop shops with their Facebook pages." The men around the table nodded sagely, as if David had just dispensed some profound wisdom. I noticed Richard from business development, checking his phone under the table, probably monitoring the unusual stock activity our latest purchases had triggered. "Did you know," David went on, clearly enjoying his audience, That Katie actually suggested we should revamp our entire Asia-Pacific strategy? Imagine, my wife, who can barely keep her consulting business afloat, trying to advise a billion-dollar buy company on international operations. More laughter. I served the dessert course, a delicate French pastry that cost more than their monthly car payments. Through the hidden earpiece I wore, I could hear our teams in Singapore confirming the final transfers of power. Every piece was in place. The funny thing is, Marcus added, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes, the little woman actually had me going for a minute there. She used all the right buzzwords: market penetration, digital transformation, synergistic growth. He affected a high-pitched, mocking tone. Almost sounded like she knew what she was talking about. David reached over and patted my hand condescendingly. That's my Katie, always trying to play in the big leagues. Honey, why don't you go get those reports you were working on? Show the guys what a real small business consultation looks like. I hesitated, making a show of discomfort. Oh, I don't think they'd be interested. No, I insist. David's voice carried that edge it got when he was showing off his perceived superiority. It'll be educational. Show them what you've been spending so much time on in your office. Time seemed to slow as I walked to my study. Through my earpiece, Sarah's voice was calm and professional. All systems ready. Security teams in position. Board members have been quietly notified. Tomorrow's announcement is locked in. I returned with a modest portfolio, the kind you'd find at any office supply store. Inside were carefully prepared documents that appeared amateurish to the untrained eye, but actually contained coded updates from our global operations. Look at this, David said, grabbing the portfolio and flipping through it with exaggerated motions. Classic small-time thinking. No vision, no real understanding of scale. He passed the papers around the table. This, gentlemen, is why some people will always be playing in the kiddie pool while others, he straightened his tie, are destined for greater things. The papers made their way around the table, each executive adding their own condescending commentary. None of them noticed the watermarks visible only under UV light, marking each document as part of our evidence collection. I particularly love this part, Richard said, pointing to a section that actually contained encrypted data about their own department's inefficiencies, where she suggests implementing a holistic digital strategy. Sounds like someone's been reading business management. For dummies! I stood quietly, absorbing their mockery while mentally reviewing the preparations for tomorrow. Their laughter covered the soft buzz of my phone, confirming that the final pieces of our plan were in place. You know what your problem is, Katie? David said, his voice carrying that fake concern he used when he thought he was being helpful. You're just not cut out for real business. Tomorrow, when I'm announced as CEO, why don't we talk about closing down your little consulting experiment? It's time to accept that some people are meant to lead, and others, he smiled patronizingly, are meant to support those who lead. That was the moment. The final confirmation that our timing was perfect. In my hidden office, computers were already executing the last phase of our share acquisition. By midnight, we would control 63% of Global Innovation's voting stock. Maybe you're right, I said softly, playing my role one last time. Maybe tomorrow will make everything clear. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of their self-congratulatory speeches and increasingly drunken boasts about their plans for the company, my company. After they left, I watched from my hidden office as their luxury cars disappeared into the night, each one tracked by our security systems. All surveillance data archived, Sarah reported through the secure channel. Legal team has confirmed we have everything we need. I looked at the clock, 11:47 p.m. In just over 9 hours, their world would turn upside down. David's last words of the night echoed in my head as he stumbled up to bed. Tomorrow, honey, you'll see what real business success looks like. Indeed, they would all see what real success looked like. and it wasn't going to be anything like they expected. The morning of the board meeting dawned with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. I woke at 4:30 a.m. long before David would stir, and slipped into my hidden office for final preparations. The sophisticated security systems hummed to life, displays illuminating with status updates from teams across the globe. Singapore office. Confirms all legal documents are in place, Sarah reported through our secure channel. Tokyo markets just closed. Our final share acquisition went through without raising flags. We now control 63.7% of voting shares. I pulled up the multiple screens showing our preparation checklist. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the timing of my entrance to the exact moment each piece of evidence would be revealed. Nothing was left to chance. Run through the morning sequence, I instructed, watching as Sarah coordinated with our various teams. 30 a.m. Security teams already in position at all global innovations facilities worldwide. 2 a.m. Legal teams standing by in New York, London, and Singapore. 7 a.m. Board members' cars have been dispatched. All drivers are our people. 8 a.m. IT systems transition begins. 9:30 a.m. The revelation. I opened my private wardrobe, hidden behind a false wall panel. While David knew me only in modest business casual attire, this secret closet held power suits from the world's top designers. I selected a black Chanel suit that cost more than David's annual bonus, paired with Louboutin heels he'd never seen me wear. The board chairman's private car is en route, Sarah updated. He's reviewed the final sequence and confirms everything is in order. In our master bathroom, I could hear David beginning his morning routine. His nervous energy was palpable. He thought today would mark his ascension to CEO. I smiled at the irony while applying my makeup, transforming from the subtle look he knew to something more befitting a global CEO. "Katie," David called out. "Where are you, honey? Today's the big day." "Just getting ready," I answered, quickly switching to my public phone as he entered the bathroom. He was already dressed in his best suit, practically vibrating with anticipated triumph. "I laid out that nice blue dress you got from Macy's," he said, adjusting his tie. "The one that doesn't make you look like you're trying too hard. Remember, today you're there as my wife, not as a businesswoman." I kept my expression neutral, thinking of the documents waiting in my briefcase, transfer of power agreements, evidence of his team's misconduct, and the new organizational chart that would reshape global innovations within hours. "Are you sure you want me there?" I asked, playing my role one last time. "It seems like such an important meeting." "Of course." He was in his element now, radiating condescension. "When they announce me as CEO, I want you to see what real corporate success looks like. Maybe it'll help you understand why your little consulting business was never going to work out." I watched him leave for the office early, eager to do final preparations for his big moment. As soon as his car disappeared, down the driveway, my hidden command center sprang into full operation. "All surveillance systems active," Sarah confirmed. "We're monitoring every conversation, every message. David's team is gathering in his office for a pre-meeting celebration." Through our security feeds, I could see them assembling in David's corner office. Marcus was already opening champagne, while Richard distributed cigars. Their premature celebration would make the coming revelation even sweeter. "Show me the boardroom preparations," I instructed. On screen, our covert teams were making final adjustments. Hidden cameras were verified, microphones tested, and presentation systems checked. Each board member's portfolio had been secretly prepared with 2 sets of documents, the ones David expected and the truth that would be revealed. "Company-wide security protocols are ready for transition," our IT chief reported through the secure channel. "At your signal, we can lock out David's entire team from all systems simultaneously." I reviewed the succession of events we'd planned. By 9:15, I would arrive at Global Innovations headquarters through a private entrance. By 9:25, I would be in the chairman's private office for final confirmation. At 9:30 exactly, I would enter the boardroom, not as David's supportive wife, but as Catherine Maxwell, majority shareholder and new CEO. Their emails are interesting, Sarah noted, monitoring the internal communications. David's already drafting his acceptance speech. Marcus is planning department-wide layoffs. They're completely oblivious. I opened my briefcase one last time, verifying each document. The evidence of their misconduct was overwhelming. Years of documented harassment, financial manipulation, and abuse of power. But more importantly, I had proof of my ownership and control, accumulated methodically while they dismissed me as irrelevant. Personal items from your hidden office have been transferred to your new CEO suite, Sarah confirmed. The executive dining room has been reserved for your first leadership team meeting this afternoon. Security passes have been updated. David and his team's access will be revoked at 9:31 a.m. I took one last look around our house, the house David thought he'd provided but had actually been bought with my money years ago. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every luxury item he'd bragged about to his friends had been purchased by my companies. Their cars are all at headquarters now, Sarah reported. David just sent a message to his team. Today we take control. If he only knew. I checked my reflection in the mirror, seeing not David's underestimated wife, but the powerful CEO I'd always been. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. A shift in posture, a change in expression, the quiet confidence of someone who knew they held all the cards. Transport standing by, Sarah announced. Your private driver is at the secure entrance. Board members have all arrived early, as requested. The chairman is waiting in his office. I picked up my briefcase, feeling the weight of the documents that would change everything. In less than 2 hours, David's carefully constructed world would shatter. His dream of becoming CEO would evaporate, replaced by the reality that he'd been unconsciously working for his wife all along. Final status check, I commanded, making my way to the secure vehicle. All systems go. All teams in position. All. Evidence prepared. All contingencies covered. Operation Shadow CEO is ready for execution. The morning sun caught my wedding ring as I entered the car. The last time I would wear this symbol of a marriage built on deception. By sunset, everything would be different. And David would finally understand what real business success looked like. At precisely 9:28 a.m., I stood in Chairman Wilson's private office, watching the final pieces of our plan fall into place through the secure tablet Sarah had provided. The executive boardroom's hidden cameras showed David and his team already seated, their expressions smug with anticipated victory. None of them had noticed that every person serving coffee or adjusting audio equipment was actually part of my security team. Are you ready? Chairman Wilson asked, his eyes twinkling with barely concealed anticipation. He'd been one of the few who'd known my true identity from the beginning, recognizing the strategic brilliance of my silent acquisition. I've been ready for years, I replied, adjusting my Chanel jacket. Through the tablet, I watched David straightening, his tie for the 100th time, rehearsing his acceptance speech under his breath. Your timing is impeccable, Wilson noted, checking his watch. David just sent a company-wide email about exciting changes coming to leadership. Rather presumptuous, wouldn't you say? I smiled, thinking of the very different announcement that would be going out within the hour. Some people mistake arrogance for authority, Charles. Today they'll learn the difference. At 9:29, Sarah's voice came through my discreet earpiece. All systems ready. Security teams in position. IT standing by to implement lockout protocols. Legal teams monitoring all communications. I took one last look in Wilson's private mirror, seeing Catherine Maxwell, CEO, looking back at me. Gone was any trace of Katie, David's underestimated wife. In her place stood a woman who had built a global business empire from the shadows. Shall we? Wilson gestured to the door, checking his watch one final time. It's 9:30. The boardroom felt like a carefully choreographed dance. Every step, every movement had been planned and rehearsed. Through the glass walls, I could see David standing at the head of the table, his moment of perceived triumph at hand. And so, as we look to the future of global innovations, he was saying as Wilson and I approached the door, we need leadership that understands the true nature of power and success. The irony of his words nearly made me laugh. Wilson entered. First, as planned. Good morning, everyone. Before we proceed with today's agenda, I have an important announcement. I watched David's expression shift from mild annoyance at the interruption to confusion as he noticed me entering behind Wilson. His eyes narrowed slightly at my attire, so different from what he was used to seeing me wear. Katie, he said, his tone a mixture of condescension and irritation. Honey, we haven't reached the announcement part yet. Why don't you wait outside until… Actually, David, Wilson cut in smoothly, your wife's timing is perfect. Everyone, please be seated. The board members, already aware of what was coming, took their places with barely concealed anticipation. David's executive team exchanged confused glances, while David himself remained standing, clearly annoyed at this deviation from his planned moment of glory. Ladies and gentlemen, Wilson continued, for the past 5 years, Global Innovations has been undergoing a quiet but significant transformation. Today, we formally announce the completion of that process. I moved to the front of the room, my Louboutins clicking purposefully against the marble floor. David's face flickered with growing uncertainty as he noticed the board members' deferential nods in my direction. What's going on? He demanded, looking between Wilson and me. Charles, we agreed that today's meeting was about the CEO transition. Indeed, it is, I cut in, my voice carrying the authority I'd hidden for so long. Though not quite the transition you were expecting. Sarah, dropping her assistant persona, distributed tablets to each board member. With one synchronized tap, the screens came alive with documentation of my ownership of Global Innovations. Allow me to properly introduce myself, I said, watching the color drain from David's face. I am Catherine Maxwell, founder of Maxwell, international group and majority shareholder of Global Innovations. The room erupted in confused murmurs from David's team, while the board members sat in satisfied silence. David's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. This is ridiculous, he sputtered. Katie runs a small consulting business. She can barely manage her client list, let alone… Actually, Wilson interrupted, Mrs. Maxwell has been managing quite a bit more than that. Through various entities and investment vehicles, she currently controls 63.7% of Global Innovations voting shares. More tablets appeared, displaying a complex web of ownership documents and financial records. David grabbed one, his hands shaking, as he scrolled through the evidence of my systematic acquisition of his company. That's impossible, Marcus blurted out. We've been monitoring all major stock purchases. Our team would have noticed… Your team, I said quietly, noticed exactly what we wanted them to notice. While you were tracking obvious purchase patterns, we were operating through dozens of seemingly unrelated entities. Every time you dismissed me as a small-time consultant, I was actually orchestrating another piece of this acquisition. The screens shifted to show a timeline of their missed opportunities, deals they'd ignored, innovations they'd dismissed, talent they'd overlooked. All had been quietly capitalized on by my various companies. The consulting business, David said slowly, realization dawning. All those client meetings were often with Global Innovations' major shareholders, I confirmed. It's amazing how much people will reveal to someone they underestimate. The security team began moving into position, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for them. David's access card quietly deactivated with a subtle red flash, the first of many privileges he was about to lose. Those dinner parties, he continued, his voice hollow. When we discussed company strategy, were all recorded and analyzed. Your tendency to mock my business acumen made you rather careless with confidential information. Thank you for that, by the way. It made this process much smoother. The screens changed again, now showing clips from various social gatherings where David and his team had dismissed or belittled my capabilities. Each snippet was followed by documentation of how their revealed information had been used to further my acquisition strategy. As of this moment, I announced, standing at the head of the table, the position David had thought would be his, I am assuming direct control as CEO of Global Innovations. David, Marcus, and Richard, your positions, have been terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your offices to collect your personal belongings. David took a step toward me, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. You can't do this. I'm your husband. Ex-husband, actually, I corrected him, removing my wedding ring. The divorce papers are being delivered to your mother's house, as we speak. I believe you're familiar with the address, since that's where you'll be living now. The look of utter defeat on his face was almost worth the years of playing the underestimated wife. Almost. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a perfectly executed chess endgame, each move precisely calculated for maximum effect. As security teams escorted David and his executives from the boardroom, I remained standing at the head of the table, watching the ripple effects of my revelations spread through Global Innovations headquarters via the security feeds displayed on my tablet. Their system access has been revoked, Sarah reported professionally, her assistant persona completely gone. IT teams are securing their computers and emails. All sensitive documents are being archived for review. Through the glass walls, I could see David being led to his office, my security team flanking him as he struggled to maintain his dignity. The executive floor had gone eerily quiet, employees frozen at their desks as they watched the procession of fallen leaders. Mrs. Maxwell, Wilson said, using my real name with obvious satisfaction, perhaps you'd like to address the remaining board members about your vision for Global Innovations? I took my seat, the CEO's seat, and opened the leather portfolio I'd carried for so many years. Inside were not the simple consultation documents David had mocked, but detailed plans for Global Innovations transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, for too long, this company has been operating at a fraction of its potential. While the previous leadership was focused on maintaining their power structure, they missed countless opportunities for innovation and growth. The screens around the boardroom came alive with data, charts, projections, and strategic analyses that I'd developed over years of silent observation. Board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from lingering shock to growing interest as they saw the depth of my understanding. Through my earpiece, I could hear the chaos unfolding in David's office. "You can't do this!" His voice crackled through the security feed. "That's my personal computer." "Actually, Mr. Morrison," one of my security team responded calmly, "all equipment belongs to Global Innovations, and Mrs. Maxwell has authorized a complete data retrieval from all executive devices." I continued my presentation, outlining the immediate changes that would reshape the company. Our first priority is dismantling the old boys network that has stifled innovation. Effective immediately, Jennifer Chen will be promoted to Chief Innovation Officer, leading our digital transformation initiative. On the security feeds, I could see Jennifer being escorted to her new office, the one David had coveted for years. The look of satisfaction on her face as she saw her name already on the door was particularly rewarding. "Sir," Sarah interrupted smoothly, "we have a situation in the executive parking garage." I glanced at my tablet to see Marcus attempting to leave with boxes of documents from his office. "Protocol 7, I instructed quietly. Within moments, security had intercepted him, and the documents, evidence of his various indiscretions, were being added to our legal team's growing file. "As you can see," I continued, gesturing to the presentation screens, "our 5-year projection includes a complete restructuring of our Asia-Pacific operations. These were the same plans David had dismissed as cute when I'd tried to discuss them at dinner parties. A message flashed across my tablet. David had just tried to access his executive account from his phone. The attempt was blocked, of course, but his increasingly desperate efforts to maintain control were almost amusing. Mrs. Maxwell, one of the board members, ventured, "These projections are remarkable. How long have you been developing this strategy?" "About as long as I've been acquiring controlling interest in the company," I replied with a slight smile. While others were focused on their quarterly bonuses, I was building a framework for sustainable growth. Through the security feeds, I watched David finally leaving his office, a small box of personal items in his hands. The custom-made desk nameplate he'd been so proud of remained behind. It belonged to the company, after all. "We've secured their devices," Sarah reported. "Initial analysis shows attempts to delete certain communications, but our backup systems captured everything. Legal is reviewing now." I nodded, turning back to the board. "You'll find complete documentation of the previous management's irregularities in Appendix C of your packets. While we won't be pursuing criminal charges at this time, the evidence will be kept secure as insurance against any potential retaliation." The board members flipped through their packets, eyebrows raising at the key extent of misconduct we'd documented. Years of harassment, financial manipulation, and abuse of power, all meticulously recorded while they thought I was just David's decorative wife. "The press release goes out in 5 minutes," Sarah announced quietly. "All major financial news. Outlets are standing by. Social media teams are prepared for the announcement." On the security screens, I could see David standing in the lobby, still shell-shocked, as his company access card failed to work on the executive elevator. The same elevator I would now use to access my new office, the one he'd spent 15 years trying to reach. "One last thing," I addressed the board. "Effective immediately, we're implementing the employee protection programs that were repeatedly rejected by previous management. The days of harassment and discrimination at Global Innovations are over." Through my earpiece, I heard David's final attempt at resistance. A call to his lawyer, made from the lobby on his personal phone. "She can't do this," he was saying. "Check her business records. She runs a small consulting firm, for God's sake." But his lawyer was already receiving our legal team's comprehensive briefing. Every document, every contract, every share transfer had been executed perfectly. David's world hadn't just been turned upside down, it had been systematically dismantled. "Marketing has confirmed the website update," Sarah reported. "Your official biography and photo are now live on the leadership page." I pulled up the company website on my tablet. There it was, my professional headshot where David's had been just an hour ago. "Catherine Maxwell, Chief Executive Officer," the caption read. No mention of the years spent pretending to be just another struggling entrepreneur. "What about the executive team meeting scheduled for 2 p.m.?" Wilson asked. "Keep it," I replied, watching David finally exit the building through the main doors that would never again open automatically for his executive access card. But in the new executive conference room, I believe the old one has too, many uncomfortable associations. The security feed showed David standing on the sidewalk, staring up at the building he'd thought would be his to command. His phone buzzed with the company-wide announcement of my appointment as CEO. The same announcement was now spreading through every floor of the building, every regional office, every subsidiary. "Shall I have his personal items from the house delivered to his mother's address?" Sarah asked discreetly. "Yes," I confirmed, "along with the divorce papers. Let's make this transition as efficient as our corporate one." The weeks following my revelation as CEO unfolded like the final act of a long-planned symphony. Each development brought new satisfaction, not from the destruction of David's world, but from watching Global Innovations transform into what it should have been all along. "The financial press won't stop calling," Sarah reported one morning, exactly 1 month after the board meeting. They're particularly interested in how you manage to acquire controlling interest without anyone noticing. The Wall Street Journal is calling it the most brilliant silent takeover in corporate history. I sat in my new office, the one David had coveted for 15 years, reviewing the latest transformation reports. The executive floor had changed dramatically. Gone were the old boys' club corner offices and their atmosphere of entitled superiority. In their place, a new energy flowed through the building. Jennifer Chen's digital transformation initiative is already showing results, Sarah continued, sliding a tablet across my desk. The same proposal David called cute last month has increased our market share by 15%. Through my floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city sprawling below. Bathed in morning light, somewhere out there, David was waking up in his mother's guest room, still struggling to understand how completely his world had changed. His LinkedIn profile makes for interesting reading, Sarah noted, a hint of amusement in her voice. He's listed himself as strategic advisor seeking new opportunities. So far, no takers. Apparently, most major tech companies have some connection to Maxwell International Group. The transformation of global innovations had been swift and comprehensive. The toxic culture that David and his team had cultivated was being systematically dismantled. Qualified employees who had been overlooked were finally receiving the recognition they deserved. Innovation was replacing intimidation. The Thompson account called again, Sarah reported. They're doubling their contract under the new leadership. Their CEO mentioned something about finally working with a company that understands modern business dynamics. I picked up a photo frame from my desk, the only personal item I'd brought to my new office. It showed my father standing proudly in front of his small tech company, years before corporate raiders had torn it away. Beside it lay the morning's business papers, their headlines still screaming about the shocking revelation at Global Innovations. David's lawyer made contact, Sarah said, checking her notes. They're trying to contest the prenup. Our legal team reminded them that David himself insisted on those terms to protect his assets from his gold-digging wife. The irony appears to have been lost on them. The security feeds showed the ongoing transformation of the building. David's executive parking space now bore my name. His custom-ordered office furniture had been donated to a local business school, a small reminder that corporate excess was no longer welcome here. The board approved all your new initiatives, Sarah continued. The Employee Development Program, the Innovation Fund, the Diversity and Leadership Program. Everything David's team blocked for years is now moving forward. I stood and walked to the window, watching the morning traffic flow below. And our former leadership team? Sarah pulled up another report. Marcus took a teaching position at a community college. Ironically, he's teaching business ethics. Richard's trying to start a consulting firm, but his calls aren't being returned. The others are similarly displaced. The divorce papers had been finalized yesterday. I'd let David keep his wedding ring, a small final reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The prenuptial agreement he'd insisted upon had worked perfectly, though not in the way he'd intended. The employee satisfaction scores are interesting, Sarah noted. They've doubled since the change in leadership. People are actually excited to come to work now. A notification popped up on my tablet. David had just posted another angry LinkedIn update about betrayal and manipulation in business. The comments section was filled with responses from former employees, sharing their own stories of how his leadership had held them back. Your father's old company called, Sarah said softly. They want to discuss a potential merger. That brought a different kind of smile to my face. The company that had once destroyed my father's dreams now wanted to be part of what I'd built. Sometimes justice comes full circle. One last thing, Sarah added, pulling up a final report. The business magazine that David always wanted to be featured in? They want to do a cover story. Their proposed title, The Silent CEO, How One Woman Transformed Corporate Power. I thought about all the dinner parties where David had mocked my little consulting business. All the times he'd explained basic business concepts to me as if I were a child. All the moments he'd proudly shown off the company resources he thought he controlled. "You know what the sweetest part is, Sarah?" I said, turning from the window. This was never about revenge. It was about building something better than they could imagine, something they could have been part of if they hadn't been so busy looking down on others. The morning sun caught my nameplate, Catherine Maxwell, Chief Executive Officer, casting a warm glow across my desk. Not David's wife, not the struggling consultant, just me, as I had always been, finally seen clearly. "The company-wide meeting starts in 10 minutes, Sarah reminded me. "Everyone's waiting to hear about the new direction." I gathered my materials, including the new corporate manifesto I was about to announce. Global Innovations would become a place where talent and innovation mattered more than gender or social connections, where ideas weren't judged by who presented them, but by their merit. "Sometimes," I said, pausing at my office door, "the most powerful move isn't taking control. It's waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that you've had it all along." Sarah smiled, holding the door. "And sometimes," she added, "the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's transformation." Together, we walked toward the auditorium, leaving behind the old world of corporate politics and male privilege. Ahead lay something far more valuable than revenge, the chance to build something truly meaningful from the ashes of their arrogance. David had wanted to rule a kingdom. I had built an empire. And the difference between the two? Vision, patience, and the understanding that true power isn't about who sits in the big office. It's about who has the wisdom to use that power for something greater than themselves.